My mother stole my dead girlfriend's love letters and read them aloud with her husband for entertainment. So, I made sure she understood what it felt like. My mother went through my love letters from Jamie, my high school girlfriend who died in a car accident senior year. I kept them in a box under my bed because they were sacred and private. They were the only pieces of her I had left. Mom was staying with me after marrying Roy, her third husband. They were between houses, and she promised it would be 2 weeks maximum. I came home from work early one Tuesday and heard laughing from the living room. Mom and Roy were on the couch with papers spread everywhere. They were my letters, and I could see Jamie's handwriting from across the room. Mom was reading one out loud in a mocking voice. She said, "I promise to love you forever, even when we're old and gray." She giggled and asked Roy if he could believe this sappy garbage. Roy was holding another letter and said this kid really thought you'd marry her. He pointed out that she drew little hearts and called it pathetic. I stood frozen because those letters were hidden under my bed in my room in a locked box. Mom looked up and saw me standing there. She said, "Oh good, you're home. We were just having some fun with your teenage drama." She told me I really should throw these away since it's been 10 years, and it's time to move on. I couldn't speak at first. Roy waved a letter at me and said my girlfriend was quite the poet. He started reading about how I was her sunshine after storms, and asked if I actually fell for this cheese. I told them to give those back right now. Mom rolled her eyes and told me to relax because they weren't hurting them, just laughing. She said I was too old to be keeping love letters anyway. I said those were mine, and they had no right. She stood up defensively and said she was my mother, so she had every right to know what was in her house. I told her this was my apartment, not her house. Mom's face went red, and she said that where she was staying made it her house too. She said she didn't keep secrets from Roy, and they shared everything. I asked if that included my private letters. She said it included everything, and that I shouldn't have things I was ashamed of. I told her I wasn't ashamed, but that Jamie died and these letters were all I had left. Mom laughed and said Jamie died 10 years ago. She said I needed therapy, not old letters. Roy added that it was creepy to keep a dead girl's letters and not healthy. I told them both to get out and pack their things. Mom acted shocked and asked if I was really kicking out my mother over some stupid letters. I said it was over her violating my privacy by going through my room and mocking my dead girlfriend. She said they weren't mocking but were enjoying some entertainment. She added that it's not like Jamie could be offended. I walked to my room and saw that the lock on my box was broken. They had pried it open with something and forced it open deliberately. They searched my room and found something private and decided to make it entertainment. I packed the letters carefully while Mom followed me. She said I was being ridiculous because they were just papers. I asked if they were just papers. Why did she break my lock to get them? She said Roy got curious after she told him about my box and they wondered what I was hiding. I asked if she really broke into it, and I called it criminal. Mom scoffed and said it wasn't criminal because she was my mother. She said mothers don't steal from sons. She claimed she wasn't stealing but investigating because I was 32, living alone, and she worried I had drugs. I asked if she thought I had drugs. Why did she read them aloud and laugh? Mom changed tactics and started crying. She said she just wanted to share something with Roy and show him how sweet I used to be before I became so cold. I asked if she did that by mocking my dead girlfriend's letters. They threw the letters at me when they left and scattered them on my floor like trash. Mom said I was ungrateful, and Roy said I needed help. They moved in with Roy's brother, but I wasn't done. Mom had violated something sacred, and she needed to understand what that felt like. I knew where she kept her important things in a storage unit across town. I had the key from when Dad died because she'd kept everything there, including his things, their wedding album, and every card he'd ever given her. These were her most precious memories. I visited the unit but didn't take anything because I didn't need to. I just reorganized everything by putting Dad's things in new boxes and mixing up the labels. I put their wedding album in a box marked tax documents and moved her love letters from Dad into a box labeled old receipts. Nothing was destroyed or stolen, just reorganized. Then I paid for 3 more months on the unit in Roy's name and changed the billing address to his brother's house. Mom didn't check the unit for weeks until her sister wanted to see Dad's war medals for a memorial. Mom went to get them and called me, screaming that I had touched her things. I answered on the 3rd ring. Mom's voice came through, so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. She was screaming about someone breaking into her storage unit and touching Dad's things. Her words came out fast and sharp, demanding to know if I was responsible for messing with her belongings. I told her yes, I did reorganize her things. I said I moved stuff around the same way she reorganized my private letters when she spread them across my living room. I explained that now she knew exactly how violation felt when someone touched your most precious memories without permission. The line went quiet for 3 seconds before she started yelling again. She said I had no right to touch Dad's things or her precious memories in that storage unit. Her voice cracked when she mentioned the wedding album and his letters. I cut her off and pointed out she had no right to break into my locked box under my bed. I reminded her she mocked Jamie's letters with Roy, reading them aloud for entertainment like they were comedy material. She tried to interrupt, but I kept talking. I said she pried open a lock to get to private letters from my dead girlfriend, and then laughed at the words Jamie wrote when she was 17 and in love. Mom's breathing got heavy on the other end. She said what I did was different because those were Dad's things and her most important keepsakes. I asked how it was different when Jamie's letters were my most important keepsakes. She didn't have an answer for that. Then she switched tactics and threatened to call the police. She said she'd report me for theft and breaking and entering because I had no legal right to access her storage unit. I stayed calm and reminded her that nothing was stolen or destroyed. I told her I just moved things around and changed some labels, which wasn't a crime. She went quiet again because she realized I was right. Calling the cops would mean explaining why she was mad, which would expose what she did first. She'd have to admit she broke into my locked box and violated my privacy in my own apartment. I heard her talking to someone in the background, probably Roy. Then Roy's voice came on the phone. He called me petty and vindictive for upsetting my mother over some old letters from high school. His tone was sharp and angry, like I was the bad guy in this situation. I told him he was the one who called Jamie's heartfelt words pathetic while reading them aloud in my living room. I reminded him he pointed at her little hearts and mocked a dead girl's expressions of love. He tried to say something else, but I hung up before he could finish. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, and I stared at it for a while. I thought I'd feel satisfied after making Mom understand what violation felt like. I thought revenge would make the anger go away, or at least make it smaller. Instead, I felt hollow and empty, like I'd lost something I couldn't get back. My hands started shaking, and I had to grip the counter edge to steady them. The anger was still there, maybe even bigger than before. It sat in my chest like a weight that kept getting heavier instead of lighter. I texted Theo and told him I needed to talk. He showed up 40 minutes later with pizza and beer. We sat on my couch and I explained everything about the storage unit and Mom's call. Theo listened without interrupting, nodding in the right places and keeping his face neutral. When I finished, he said he understood why I did it. He said Mom needed to learn about boundaries and consequences. But then he asked if it actually helped or just made things worse. I stared at my beer bottle and picked at the label. I admitted I didn't know anymore because Mom finally understood what violation felt like. She knew the panic of finding precious memories disturbed and the anger of someone touching things that weren't theirs. But now we were both hurt and angry, stuck in this cycle that kept spinning. Theo leaned back and said, maybe that was the problem with revenge. He suggested it just multiplied the pain instead of resolving anything. Each person hurt the other back and forth until nobody remembered what started the fight in the first place. I knew he was right, but didn't want to admit it out loud. The next morning at work, I sat at my desk staring at spreadsheets without seeing the numbers. My boss walked by twice asking if I was okay, and I said yes both times. My coworker Isla noticed I kept checking my phone and zoning out during meetings. She stopped by my desk after lunch and asked if everything was okay at home. I gave her the basic story about the fight with Mom, leaving out some details but hitting the main points. Isla pulled up a chair and sat down. She told me she had a similar falling out with her mom years ago over boundaries. Her mom kept showing up unannounced and going through her mail, treating her apartment like it was still her childhood bedroom. It took them 2 years to rebuild any kind of relationship after Isla finally snapped and changed her locks. She said the question wasn't who was more wrong in the situation. The real question was whether I wanted a relationship with my mother at all going forward. I sat there thinking about Dad and how he'd feel seeing Mom and me like this. He always said family was the most important thing, even when they drove you crazy. The thought of his disappointment hit me harder than I expected. My chest got tight, and I had to look away from Isla so she wouldn't see my eyes getting wet. I realized I didn't actually know what I wanted anymore because the anger was so big it blocked everything else. Mom was still my mom despite everything she'd done. Dad would be heartbroken watching us tear each other apart over letters and storage units and hurt feelings that kept piling up. I went to work the next day but couldn't focus on anything. My desk felt like a prison, and the spreadsheets on my screen blurred together into meaningless numbers. My boss walked past twice and asked if I was okay, and both times I nodded and said I was fine even though I wasn't. Isla stopped by my cubicle after lunch and pulled up a chair without asking. She told me I looked terrible and asked what was going on at home. I gave her the basic version about Mom and the letters and the storage unit, leaving out some details but hitting the main points. She listened without interrupting, and her face got more serious as I talked. When I finished, she sat back and crossed her arms. She said she had a similar thing happen with her mom years ago, about boundaries and unannounced visits. Her mom kept showing up and going through her mail like the apartment was still her childhood bedroom. Isla said it took 2 years to rebuild anything after she finally changed the locks. She asked me the real question, which was whether I actually wanted a relationship with Mom going forward. I sat there staring at my keyboard and thought about Dad. He always said family was the most important thing even when they made you crazy. The idea of him being disappointed in me hit hard and my chest got tight. I had to look away from Isla so she wouldn't see my eyes getting wet. I told her I didn't know what I wanted anymore because the anger was blocking everything else. 3 days passed before Mom called again. I was making dinner when my phone rang, and I almost didn't answer. Her voice sounded different this time, quieter and less defensive. She said she'd been thinking about everything that happened. She admitted she shouldn't have gone through my things, but she was still furious I touched Dad's belongings and her wedding album. I gripped the phone tighter and told her those items meant everything to her the same way Jamie's letters meant everything to me. That was exactly my point. She went quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her breathing change through the phone. It sounded like she might be crying, but I couldn't tell for sure. She said she didn't think about it that way before. She thought I was just being dramatic about old teenage love letters from high school. I explained that Jamie died, and those letters were all I had left of her voice, her handwriting, her love for me. Each letter was a piece of her that I could hold and read when I missed her. Mom's voice cracked when she spoke again. She admitted she knew Jamie died, but didn't realize I was still grieving after 10 years. I told her grief doesn't have an expiration date, especially when someone dies young and suddenly like Jamie did. Those letters helped me remember the good times before the accident took her away. Mom started crying for real then, and I could hear her trying to hold it back. We ended the call without any real resolution, but something had shifted in the conversation. For the first time, Mom seemed to actually hear what I was saying, instead of just defending herself and Roy. I set my phone down and stared at my half-cooked dinner, not hungry anymore. The next day, Aunt Catherine called while I was at work. I stepped outside to take it because her voice sounded serious. She said Mom told her everything about both the letters and the storage unit. Catherine was disappointed in both of us for hurting each other instead of talking like adults. I defended myself immediately and explained what Mom and Roy did. They read Jamie's intimate words aloud and laughed at her expressions of love. They called her drawings of hearts pathetic and mocked everything she wrote to me. Catherine sighed and said that was cruel. She agreed. But my retaliation was also cruel, and now we were stuck in a cycle of hurting each other back and forth. She suggested family therapy, or at least a conversation with her there to mediate. She said this fight was destroying what was left of our family. I was resistant at first because therapy sounded like admitting I was wrong. Catherine reminded me that Dad would want us to try to that stopped my argument cold. I agreed to meet with Mom, but only if Catherine was present and Roy stayed away. I told her I couldn't be in the same room with Roy right now after what he did. Catherine said she understood and would arrange everything. She promised Roy wouldn't be there, and it would just be the three of us talking. The meeting got set for the following Saturday at Catherine's house. I spent the entire week feeling anxious and sick to my stomach. I rehearsed what I wanted to say over and over in my head during work and at night before bed. I wrote down my feelings in a notebook so I wouldn't forget anything important when the moment came. Theo came over on Thursday to help me prepare. He sat on my couch and played Mom's part while I practiced staying calm and explaining my side. He threw hard questions at me and pushed back on my arguments like Mom would. He reminded me the goal was communication, not winning an argument or making Mom hurt more than she already did. By Friday night, I had my notes memorized and my points organized. I knew what I needed to say about the violation and the grief and why those letters mattered so much. Saturday morning came too fast. I sat at my kitchen table with coffee going cold in front of me while staring at my notebook full of talking points. Theo was supposed to arrive at 9 to help me practice, and I kept checking my phone even though it was only 8:30. My hands shook a little when I picked up the mug, so I set it back down and just stared at the steam rising off the surface. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 and I jumped even though I'd been expecting it. Theo came in carrying a bag from the bakery down the street and dropped it on my counter. He pulled out 2 muffins and handed me one without asking if I wanted it. I took a bite just to have something to do with my hands. He sat across from me at the table and asked if I was ready to practice. I told him I didn't know what I was ready for anymore. He picked up my notebook and flipped through the pages covered in my messy handwriting. He said we needed to go through this out loud, so I could hear how it sounded instead of just reading it in my head. I nodded, and he stood up, walking around to the other side of the room. He turned to face me, and his whole posture changed. His shoulders hunched forward a little, and his mouth pressed into a thin line. He asked in a voice that sounded eerily like Mom's why I was making such a big deal out of some old papers. The imitation caught me off guard, and I actually laughed for a second before catching myself. Theo stayed in character and crossed his arms over his chest. He said I was being dramatic and needed to let go of the past. I felt my jaw tighten even though I knew this was just practice. I started to respond, but my voice came out shaky, so I stopped and took a breath. Theo dropped the act for a moment and reminded me to stay calm no matter what Mom said. He told me the goal was communication, not winning an argument or making her hurt more than she already did. I asked him how I was supposed to stay calm when she violated something so important to me. He said that was exactly why we were practicing, so I could get the anger out now instead of during the actual conversation. We went through it 3 more times with Theo playing mom and throwing every defensive response he could think of at me. By the 4th round, I managed to keep my voice steady and stick to my main points without getting sidetracked by anger. Theo finally sat back down and said I was ready as I'd ever be. He reminded me that Catherine would be there to keep things from getting too heated. I thanked him, and he left around 11, telling me to text him after the meeting no matter how it went. I spent the rest of Friday night barely sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mom's face when she looked up and caught me watching her read Jamie's letters. I got up around 6 on Saturday morning and took a shower that lasted way too long. I stood under the hot water trying to wash away the nervous energy crawling under my skin. My stomach felt tight and wrong, like I might throw up even though I hadn't eaten anything since Theo's muffin yesterday. I got dressed in jeans and a plain shirt, nothing fancy because this wasn't some formal occasion. I checked my phone and saw a text from Catherine confirming everything was still on for 2 o'clock at her place. The drive to Catherine's house took 30 minutes but felt like 3 hours. I gripped the steering wheel too tight and my knuckles went white. Every red light made me want to turn around and go home. I kept thinking about what I wanted to say and whether Mom would actually listen or just get defensive again. Catherine lived in a quiet neighborhood with big trees lining the streets. I pulled up in front of her house at exactly 2 and saw Mom's car already parked in the driveway. My stomach dropped and I sat in my car for a full minute trying to make myself open the door. I finally forced myself out and walked up the front path. Catherine opened the door before I could knock, like she'd been watching for me. She gave me a quick hug and said she was glad I came. I followed her inside to the kitchen where Mom sat at the table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug. She looked up when I walked in, and I barely recognized her. She looked tired in a way I'd never seen before, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She'd always been so put together, but right now she just looked old and worn down. I sat across from her at the table, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. Catherine poured me coffee without asking and set the mug down in front of me. She sat at the head of the table between us and folded her hands together. Catherine cleared her throat and said we needed to establish some ground rules before we started. No yelling at each other, no interrupting when the other person was talking, and both of us had to actually listen instead of just waiting for our turn to speak. Mom nodded without looking at me. I agreed out loud because staying silent felt wrong. Catherine asked who wanted to go first, and Mom gestured at me like she was giving me permission. I took a breath and started explaining how violated I felt coming home to find my locked box broken open. I told them about standing in my doorway watching my most precious memories being mocked for entertainment. My voice stayed steady at first, but started to crack when I got to the part about hearing Roy call Jamie's love pathetic. I had to stop and swallow hard before I could keep going. I explained that those letters weren't just old papers from high school, they were the only pieces of Jamie I had left after she died. Mom kept her eyes down on her coffee mug the whole time I talked. Her jaw was tight with tension, and I could see her fingers gripping the mug hard enough that her knuckles went pale. When I finished, she sat quiet for what felt like forever. Finally, she looked up at me and said she honestly didn't think I'd care that much about old letters from high school. She thought I'd moved on after 10 years, and maybe even find it funny looking back at teenage romance. Her voice sounded defensive but also confused, like she genuinely couldn't understand why this mattered so much to me. I leaned forward and told her I never moved on from Jamie because you don't move on from someone who died. You just learn to live with the loss and find ways to keep their memory alive. Those letters were my way of staying connected to who she was and remembering what we had together. I said losing someone at 17 to a sudden accident isn't something you get over. It's something you carry with you forever. Mom's face changed while I talked, and her eyes started to fill with tears. She wiped at them quickly with the back of her hand. She said she didn't understand because she'd never lost someone she loved that way. When Dad died, it was after a long illness, and they'd had decades together to prepare for the end. She said she couldn't imagine what it would have been like if Dad had just been gone one day without warning when they were still young. Her voice broke on the last words, and she started crying for real. She covered her face with her hands, and her shoulders shook. Catherine reached over and put a hand on Mom's arm, but didn't say anything. Mom finally looked up at me with tears running down her face. She admitted that reading the letters with Roy was wrong and cruel. She said she was trying to bond with her new husband by sharing something from my past, and she thought it would be funny to look back at how dramatic teenage love could be. She called herself stupid and said she should have known better than to touch something so private. She said she was sorry for hurting me and that she never meant to make me feel like Jamie's memory didn't matter. I felt something shift in my chest when she said sorry. It was the first real apology she'd offered instead of just making excuses or defending herself. But I was still hurt, and the anger hadn't completely gone away. I told her the apology didn't undo what happened or erase the memory of them laughing at Jamie's words. I said I could still hear Roy's voice calling her drawings of hearts pathetic and Mom giggling like it was all just a joke. Mom nodded and said she knew that, and she didn't expect me to forgive her right away. She said she just needed me to know that she understood now why it hurt so much. Catherine looked at me and asked why I chose to get revenge by messing with the storage unit, instead of just talking to Mom about how hurt I was. I sat back in my chair and thought about how to answer that. Finally, I admitted I wanted her to feel the same violation and panic I felt when I found my letters scattered on the floor. I wanted her to know what it was like to have someone touch your most precious memories without permission and treat them like they didn't matter. Mom wiped her eyes with her napkin and nodded slowly. She said it worked because she was really scared when she couldn't find Dad's things at first. She thought someone had broken in and stolen her most precious memories. She spent 3 hours going through every box in that storage unit in a complete panic before she realized everything was just mixed up and relabeled. She said her hands were shaking the whole time, and she kept thinking about all the things she'd lost, like Dad's medals and their wedding photos and the letters he wrote her during deployment. She said she finally understood what I must have felt coming home and finding my letters scattered on the floor like trash. I told her that was exactly right. I said finding those letters thrown everywhere after they mocked them made me feel like my precious memories were just garbage to be tossed around. I wanted her to know how that violation felt, to understand what it's like when someone treats your most sacred things like they're nothing. Mom's face crumpled and she started crying again. She said she was so sorry and she never meant to make me feel that way. Catherine let us sit in silence for a minute while Mom cried and I stared at my hands. Then Catherine leaned forward and said we'd both made our points now and hurt each other. She said the real question was what happens next. She asked if we wanted to keep hurting each other or find a way to repair the relationship. I looked at Mom and she looked back at me with red eyes. Mom spoke first and said she wanted to repair things. She said I was her only son and she didn't want to lose me over this. She admitted she'd been a difficult mother sometimes, especially after Dad died, and she knew Roy wasn't my favorite person. Her voice was quiet, and she kept twisting her napkin in her hands. I took a deep breath and told her I appreciated that. But I said Roy participated in mocking Jamie, and I didn't think I could forgive him for that. I said it meant family gatherings would be really awkward if we tried to fix things between us. Mom's face went through several expressions and finally settled on something pained. She said she understood, and she wouldn't force me to spend time with Roy. She said she'd come see me alone, and we could rebuild our relationship without him there. Catherine suggested we start slowly with occasional phone calls and maybe coffee meetups without Roy present. She also said we should both see therapists individually to work through our issues. Mom and I both agreed to try. The meeting wrapped up about 20 minutes later with an awkward hug between Mom and me. It was the first physical contact we'd had since the letter incident. She felt smaller than I remembered, and she held on a little too long. It didn't fix everything, but it felt like a small step towards something better. I drove home feeling exhausted and emotionally drained, but also lighter somehow. Over the next few weeks, Mom and I texted occasionally. The first text she sent was just asking how I was doing. I waited an hour before responding that I was okay. We had 2 brief coffee meetups during that time. The first one was at a cafe near my apartment. Mom arrived 10 minutes early and was already sitting at a table when I got there. We ordered coffee and sat across from each other, making small talk. The conversation was really stilted at first. We talked about the weather and she asked about my job. I asked about her sister. Neither of us mentioned Roy or Jamie or the letters. It felt weird and formal, like we were strangers. The second coffee meetup was a week and a half later at a different place. This one went a little better. We gradually found safer topics like my work projects and Catherine's family. Mom told me about her garden and a book she was reading. By the end, we were almost having a normal conversation. I started seeing a therapist 3 weeks after the meeting at Catherine's house. I found someone who specialized in grief and family conflict through my insurance website. Her office was in a brick building downtown. The first session was mostly her asking questions about my background and what brought me in. I told her about Jamie and the letters and Mom and everything that happened. Talking to a professional about it helped me understand things I hadn't seen before. She helped me realize that I'd been carrying Jamie's loss for 10 years without really processing it. I'd just been preserving it in those letters, like keeping her frozen in time. The therapist asked me what I thought would happen if I let go of the letters. I said I was scared I'd forget Jamie or lose the connection I had to her. She pointed out that memories live in me, not in paper. Over several sessions, the therapist helped me see that my anger at Mom was bigger than it should have been because of unresolved grief. She said Mom's violation of the letters felt like losing Jamie all over again. That's why I reacted so strongly and wanted revenge. This insight didn't excuse what Mom did. Breaking into my locked box and mocking Jamie's words was still cruel and wrong, but it helped me understand my intense reaction and why I couldn't let it go. I started working on processing Jamie's death properly instead of just holding on to it through letters. Mom met me at the same cafe we'd been using for our meetups, and this time she looked different somehow. She had her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and seemed nervous about something. She waited until I sat down before she started talking. She told me she'd been seeing a therapist for the past month and working through some things about boundaries and respect. I was surprised because Mom never believed in therapy before, always said it was for people who couldn't handle their problems. She admitted she'd been too nosy my whole life, always going through my things when I was a kid and justifying it as motherly concern. She said her therapist helped her see that it wasn't concern but control, and it damaged our relationship over the years. She looked down at her coffee and said she understood now why I reacted so strongly to the letter incident, because it wasn't just about that one violation, but years of her not respecting my privacy. I didn't know what to say at first because this was the most self-aware I'd ever heard her sound. She kept going and told me Roy was upset about being excluded from our coffee meetings. He wanted to come along and felt like she was choosing me over him. Mom said she told him no, because he needed to give me space after what happened, and my comfort mattered more than his feelings right now. I appreciated that more than I could express because Mom usually prioritized her husbands over everything else. She was actually putting me first for once in my adult life. Work felt different the next week because I wasn't carrying around the same anger anymore. Isla noticed during our lunch break and commented that I seemed lighter somehow, less distracted and tense. I told her about the therapy sessions and the slow progress with Mom, how we were actually having real conversations now. Isla smiled and said she was proud of me for doing the hard work instead of just staying mad. She reminded me that anger is easy, but healing takes actual effort and courage. I realized she was right because I could have kept hating Mom forever and felt justified doing it. But that wouldn't have fixed anything or made me feel better in the long run. Isla shared more about her own experience with her mother and how they eventually rebuilt their relationship through therapy and honest communication. She said it took years but was worth it because family connections matter, even when they're complicated and messy. Theo called me that Thursday and invited me to a small gathering at his place on Saturday. Just a few friends hanging out, nothing big or formal. I almost said no out of habit because I'd been avoiding social stuff for weeks. But something made me agree because I realized I'd been isolating myself since the whole situation with Mom started. Saturday came, and I drove to Theo's apartment feeling weird about being around people again. His place was warm and filled with laughter when I arrived. There were maybe 6 people there. Some I knew, and some I didn't. We played cards and watched a movie and just talked about normal stuff like work and weekend plans. Nobody asked about my family drama or brought up anything heavy. Being around friends and laughing again reminded me that life existed beyond family problems and old grief. I'd been so focused on Mom and Jamie and everything painful that I forgot about the good parts of my life. The parts that were still here and worth enjoying. Mom and I met for coffee again the following Tuesday. She seemed hesitant about something and kept starting sentences, then stopping. Finally, she asked if she could see one of Jamie's letters, not to mock it, but to understand what they meant to me. My first reaction was immediate panic and anger because those letters were still off limits in my mind. But Mom explained she wanted to truly understand why they mattered so much, why her violation hurt me so deeply. She promised she would read it respectfully and privately, not perform it or make jokes. I told her I needed to think about it because sharing those letters felt impossible after what happened. She nodded and said she understood, and we moved on to other topics. But the request stayed with me all week. I kept thinking about whether showing her one letter might help her really get it, help her see Jamie as a real person instead of just teenage drama. The next time we met, I brought one of the less personal letters with me. My hands shook as I pulled it from my bag. I chose one where Jamie wrote about a movie we'd seen together and how happy she was just spending time with me. Nothing too intimate or private, but enough to show her voice and her heart. Mom took the letter carefully like it might break. She unfolded it slowly and started reading, and I watched her face the whole time. Her expression changed as she read Jamie's handwriting and her words about loving me and feeling safe with me. When Mom finished reading, she had tears in her eyes. She looked up at me and her voice cracked when she spoke. She said Jamie wrote beautifully and clearly loved me deeply, and she was so sorry for treating these precious words like a joke. Mom handed the letter back with both hands, like it was something sacred. She told me she finally understood why I kept them and why her actions were so cruel. This wasn't just teenage drama or old papers. This was the voice of someone I loved who was gone forever. Mom wiped her eyes and started talking about Dad's letters. She said he wrote her love letters during his military deployment before they got married. They were in the storage unit with his other things, and she kept them because they were proof of their love when they were young. She said if anyone ever mocked those letters or laughed at Dad's words, she would be destroyed. The comparison clicked for her in a way my explanations never had. She finally truly understood why I reacted so strongly and why revenge felt necessary. I asked Mom if she wanted help reorganizing the storage unit properly since I was the one who messed everything up. She looked surprised by the offer but accepted it immediately. We made plans for the following Saturday to spend a few hours sorting through Dad's things and her memories. I felt nervous about it all week because going through Dad's stuff together felt intimate and vulnerable. Saturday morning came and we met at the storage unit. Mom unlocked the door and we stepped into the small space filled with boxes and old furniture. The air smelled like cardboard and dust and old memories. We started pulling boxes out and checking labels against contents. I found Dad's war medals mixed in with old tax papers and handed them to Mom. She held them carefully and told me stories about when Dad earned each one. We worked side by side for 3 hours, sorting and organizing and putting things in their proper places. Working together in that storage unit changed something between us. Mom talked about Dad and their early years in ways she never had before. She told me about their first apartment and how Dad would leave her notes before going to work. She shared stories about their struggles and fights and how they almost broke up twice before getting married. I learned things about my parents' relationship I never knew, like how Dad proposed 3 times before Mom said yes because she was scared of marriage. Mom showed me the letters Dad wrote during deployment, and I read a few with her permission. His handwriting was messy, but his words were beautiful, talking about missing her and dreaming about their future together. Mom's face softened as she remembered receiving those letters and how they got her through lonely months when he was overseas. She said those letters kept their love alive across distance and uncertainty. Mom pulled out the wedding album from the box where I'd hidden it. We sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit and looked through it together. The photos showed my parents young and happy, and so in love it hurt to see. Mom was beautiful in her simple white dress, and Dad looked proud standing next to her. I'd never really looked at these photos as an adult, never seen my parents as people separate from being my parents. Mom pointed out different guests and told me stories about the day. She remembered what the weather was like and what songs they danced to, and how Dad cried during his vows. Her face softened with the memories, and she looked younger somehow, like she was back in that moment. She turned to me and said she hoped I would find love like that again someday. Not to replace Jamie, but to build something new with someone who made me happy. The comment surprised me because Mom usually avoided talking about my love life or future relationships. I mentioned to Mom that I'd been talking to someone at my gym recently. Nothing serious yet, just casual conversations after workouts, but there seemed to be something there worth exploring. Mom's whole face changed when I said it. She leaned forward and asked what the woman was like, if we had plans to meet outside the gym, how long we'd been talking. The questions came fast but felt genuine, not intrusive like her usual prying. I told her about how we'd started chatting by the water fountain, then moved to coffee after morning sessions, and how easy the conversations felt. Mom smiled and said she was happy I was opening myself up to someone new. She reached across the storage unit floor and squeezed my hand. This was the kind of conversation we should have been having all along. The normal mother-son talks about life and relationships and moving forward. I realized how much I'd missed having her as an actual supportive parent instead of someone I had to defend myself against. Mom got quiet for a minute, then admitted something I wasn't expecting. She said Roy might not be the right fit for the long term. The words came out slowly, like she was testing how they sounded. She explained that she'd rushed into the marriage because she was so lonely after Dad died, and Roy had been there offering companionship when she needed it most. But now she was seeing problems she'd ignored at first. The way he didn't respect boundaries, how he made jokes at other people's expense, his need to be included in everything even when it wasn't appropriate. Mom said she was thinking about suggesting couples counseling, or maybe even separation if things didn't improve. Her honesty shocked me because Mom never admitted when her relationships weren't working. She usually doubled down and insisted everything was perfect until the inevitable divorce papers arrived. I told her I was surprised she was being so open about it. She looked at me with tired eyes and said our fight had made her evaluate a lot of things. I said I just wanted her to be happy, even if Roy was the one who made her happy, but I needed him to respect boundaries and understand what he'd done wrong. Mom nodded and said she'd talk to him about making a genuine apology to me. Not the half-hearted sorry that came with excuses, but a real acknowledgement of how cruel his behavior had been. She said she was starting to see Roy more clearly now, the way an outsider might see him, and she didn't love everything she was noticing. The storage unit felt smaller somehow, more intimate, as we sat surrounded by Dad's things and had the most honest conversation we'd had in years. 2 weeks later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Roy's voice came through, awkward and uncertain. He said Mom had helped him understand how cruel his behavior was with Jamie's letters. He apologized for mocking her words and treating my grief like entertainment. He said he'd been trying to bond with Mom by laughing at something from my past, but he'd never stopped to think about how sacred those letters were to me. Roy admitted he'd been insensitive and hurtful, and he was genuinely sorry for the pain he'd caused. His voice sounded different from I remembered, less cocky and more humble. He said he knew words couldn't undo what happened, but he wanted me to know he understood now why it was so wrong. I accepted the apology, but told him rebuilding trust would take time. I explained that I needed him to respect my boundaries going forward, and that meant not going through my things, not making jokes about Jamie, and understanding that some topics were off limits. Roy agreed immediately and said he understood if I needed space from him while Mom and I repaired our relationship. He said he wouldn't push himself into our meetups or expect things to go back to normal right away. The call ended after a few more minutes of awkward but sincere conversation. I sat staring at my phone afterward, processing what had just happened. Roy had actually apologized like a real adult, taking responsibility without making excuses. It didn't erase what he'd done, but it was more than I'd expected from him. Mom called me a few days later, her voice bright and excited. She said things with Roy were getting better after they'd had some honest conversations about respect and boundaries. They'd decided to go to couples counseling together to work on their communication issues. Mom sounded happier than she had in months, more energetic and hopeful. She thanked me for being patient with her and for not giving up on our relationship even when things got bad. I could hear Roy in the background saying something, and Mom laughed before telling him to give her a minute. The sound of her genuine laughter made something in my chest relax. Maybe they could make it work after all, if they were both willing to put in the effort. Catherine called the next week with an invitation to Thanksgiving dinner. She wanted the whole family there, including me, Mom, Roy, and her husband Marvin. My stomach dropped at the thought of sitting around a table with Roy, making small talk over turkey and stuffing. Catherine must have sensed my hesitation because she quickly added that it would be good for everyone to spend time together in a normal family setting. She said avoiding Roy forever wasn't realistic, and holidays were a good neutral ground for starting fresh. I agreed to come, even though my nerves were already building. The thought of Thanksgiving dinner with Roy sitting across from me made my hands sweat, but Catherine was right. I couldn't avoid him indefinitely if Mom was staying with him. Thanksgiving arrived cold and gray. I drove to Catherine's house with my hands tight on the steering wheel, rehearsing small talk in my head. Mom and Roy were already there when I walked in. Roy stayed on the other side of the kitchen when I entered, giving me space without making it obvious. He nodded at me and I nodded back, a small acknowledgement that we were both trying. Mom hugged me tight and whispered that she was glad I came. Dinner was awkward at first, everyone too careful with their words and too aware of the tension. But Roy kept his distance and was respectful when we did interact, passing dishes without commentary and keeping his conversation focused on safe topics like work and weather. Mom seemed happier and more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. She laughed at Marvin's stories and asked me questions about my gym friend, including everyone in the conversation naturally. The family dinner felt almost normal by the time we got to dessert. After dinner, Mom suggested we take a walk around Catherine's neighborhood. The air was cold but clear, and we walked side by side down streets lined with houses decorated for the holidays. Mom thanked me for giving her another chance. She said our relationship meant more to her than she'd realized until she almost lost it. She admitted she'd taken me for granted, assuming I'd always be there no matter how she treated me. The fight over Jamie's letters had shown her how wrong that assumption was. Mom said she'd been doing a lot of thinking in therapy about her patterns with relationships and boundaries. She was working on being less invasive and more respectful of other people's privacy and feelings. I listened as we walked, watching our breath fog in the cold air. I told Mom I was glad we'd worked through this because Dad would have wanted us to fix things. She stopped walking and looked at me with tears in her eyes. She agreed, and said she thought Dad would be proud of how we'd handled the aftermath, even if the initial incident was a disaster. We'd both made mistakes, hurt each other badly, but we'd also both worked to repair the damage instead of just walking away. Mom said that was what mattered in the end, the willingness to try to fix what was broken. We stood there on the sidewalk for a minute, just looking at each other, and I saw my mom clearly for maybe the first time in years. Not perfect, not always right, but trying her best and willing to admit when she was wrong. We hugged in Catherine's driveway, and the gesture felt different this time, less stiff and more real. I drove home thinking about Mom's face when she talked about Dad and how much pain she still carried from losing him. My next therapy session happened 3 days later, and I brought up something that had been bothering me since Thanksgiving. I told my therapist that I still felt anchored to Jamie's letters in a way that might not be healthy anymore. She asked what I meant by anchored, and I explained that the letters were my way of keeping Jamie alive, but maybe they were also keeping me stuck in the past. My therapist helped me understand that honoring Jamie's memory didn't mean letting grief define my entire life. She suggested I could write Jamie a final letter, not to forget her, but to say goodbye properly and thank her for the love we shared. The idea scared me at first because it felt like letting go completely, but my therapist explained it was about making space for new experiences while still treasuring what we had. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table with a blank piece of paper in front of me. Writing to Jamie after all these years felt strange but necessary. I wrote about the good memories we shared, the way she made me laugh and how her letters had helped me through the hardest years after she died. I thanked her for loving me and told her I would always carry a piece of her in my heart, but I was ready to move forward now. I told her I thought she would want me to be happy and find love again instead of staying frozen in grief. The letter took me 2 hours to write, and I cried through most of it. But when I finished, I felt lighter somehow. I carefully folded Jamie's original letters and placed them in a new locked box I'd bought, this one with a better lock that couldn't be pried open. I put my final letter to her on top before closing the box and storing it in my closet. The letters would always be there when I needed them, but they didn't need to be the center of my life anymore. The woman from the gym approached me the following week while I was stretching after a workout. Her name was Isla, the same as my coworker, which made me smile when she introduced herself. She asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, and I surprised myself by saying yes immediately instead of making excuses. We met at a cafe near the gym 2 days later, and the conversation flowed easily from the start. Isla worked as a graphic designer and had recently moved to the area for a new job. She talked about her love of hiking and asked about my interests, and I found myself sharing stories about my work and my friends without the usual guardedness I carried. She mentioned she'd noticed me at the gym for months and finally worked up the courage to talk to me. I told her I was glad she did, and meant it genuinely. We talked for almost 3 hours, and I felt excited about someone new for the first time in years, which felt like real progress. Isla was funny and easy to talk to, and she didn't make me feel pressured or rushed into anything. When we said goodbye outside the cafe, she suggested we do it again soon, and I agreed without hesitation. I texted Theo that night to tell him about the date, and he responded with multiple excited messages saying he was proud of me for putting myself out there. I went to bed feeling hopeful about where things might go with Isla, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Mom called me the following Sunday morning, and we talked for almost an hour about our weeks. She told me about a project Roy was working on, and I shared updates about work and mentioned my coffee date with Isla. Mom sounded genuinely excited for me and asked questions about what Isla was like and when I planned to see her again. The conversation felt natural and easy, nothing like the tense exchanges we'd had for months after the letter incident. We established a routine after that call where we checked in every Sunday, sometimes talking for just 20 minutes and other times for over an hour. The conversations were filled with normal updates about daily life, occasional deeper talks about therapy or family memories, and genuine interest in each other's lives. Mom told me during one call that she and Roy were doing much better after working through their issues in counseling. I shared that I was seeing Isla regularly, and things were going well, and Mom said she hoped to meet her someday when I was ready. Our relationship felt healthier than it had been in years, built on actual communication and respect instead of assumptions and boundary violations. 6 months after the letter incident, I found myself in a genuinely good place for the first time in a long time. Isla and I had been dating for 4 months, and the relationship felt promising and real. We'd introduced each other to our friends and spent weekends hiking or exploring new restaurants together. She knew about Jamie and the letters and understood why that part of my past was important without making me feel guilty for moving forward. Mom and I talked every Sunday without fail and occasionally met for lunch when our schedules allowed. She'd stopped pushing boundaries and respected my privacy in ways she never had before. Roy had backed off significantly and kept his distance during family gatherings, which made everything easier. I still kept Jamie's letters in their locked box in my closet, but I didn't need to look at them as often anymore. The grief was still there, but it didn't consume me the way it used to. I'd learned that protecting what's precious doesn't mean holding on to pain forever, and that forgiveness can coexist with boundaries. Mom learned that respecting privacy isn't optional even with family, and we both learned that relationships require actual effort and communication to survive hard times. The storage unit incident had forced us both to confront how we treated each other and what we valued most. Neither of us was perfect, and we'd both made mistakes, but we'd also both committed to doing better and rebuilding what was broken. Dad would have been proud of us for working through it instead of giving up completely.